Pranam everyone. Welcome everyone to our first seminar of the PATCCh seminar series. We are starting today. I apologize if you didn't get the invitation early enough. There was an issue with the distribution list, but it won't happen again, or not exactly the same problem. But thank you for making it, to those of you who are with us today. You may have heard that we'll be having these seminars on the third Wednesday of every month, initially in this slot from 1 to 2, but we'll also be looking at other possibilities if we find that this is a really difficult slot to attend. In any case, seminars will be recorded and shared on the OneDrive folder. So it's a pleasure to have the three speakers with us today. I'll be introducing them later on, but I just thought I would say we've got two other speakers confirmed for the next two sessions. On the 21st of February, we've got Professor Lise Fontaine, and on the 20th of March, we've got Professor Scott Otford. So looking forward to those as well. If you're interested in giving a seminar or some kind of session and you'd like to use the slot, let me know and I will try to coordinate a date with you. We thought of giving a chance to the thematic groups which might emerge within the PATCCh network as well. So if you want to do it as a thematic group and rather than as an individual, that's fine as well. So I will be chairing the sessions whenever available, and the speakers will have about 40 minutes to give a talk, and then that will hopefully give us about 10 to 15 minutes for discussion and Q&A. So I will be inviting colleagues to put their questions in the chat or unmute themselves if they want to ask questions directly. And I will be inviting everyone to mute themselves during the actual talk, just so we have no unfortunate interventions. So I will now be introducing the three speakers for today. So Professor Thora Tenbrink is Professor of Linguistics and Dean of Research at the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at Bangor University. She uses linguistic discourse analysis to understand how people think, especially about place and place attachment in relation to climate change and engagement. She is director of the Places of Climate Change Research Centre at Bangor University, as well as co-leading the PATCCh WISERD network. We've also got Morwenna. She's a research fellow at the Biocomposite Centre in Bangor University, specializing in timber and bio-based materials. She has a keen interest in the role materials play in addressing climate change. This can be in reducing carbon footprint, improving efficiency, increasing storage of sequestered carbon, and extending materials lifetime within the circular economy. And we've also got Sofie. Sofie Roberts is a research officer at Bangor University. Her research projects involve evaluating community perceptions and involvement in climate projects, aiming at low carbon emissions and environmental sustainability. And she has a background in the low carbon sector. So many thanks for agreeing to give this first seminar, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. So yeah, this is going to be a bit of an introductory talk where we sort of lay out our views from Bangor on the PATCCh WISERD network. So PATCCh stands for Place-Based Approaches to Climate Change. Next slides, please. So this picture basically shows the motivation for why would we want to approach climate change topics from a local perspective. So the idea is basically if we see something happening which might be due to climate change, for instance, a very beautiful area gets destroyed due to droughts or floods or whatever, then it will break our heart. But it will probably break our heart much more if it's our local area, our home patch where this happens. So climate change happens globally, but it is felt locally, and we relate to that based on the places that we live and where we that we love and where we live. Next slide, please. So why would we think about climate change locally? First of all, it matters to us locally, and that's a fact from basically from cognitive science. Human cognition is geared towards relevance. Relevance drives our perception, it drives our thoughts, it drives our actions, and it drives the way we communicate. So that's something that's also looked at in linguistics as something. So relevance is sort of in the center of everything, and things that are local will matter to us. Also, local places or our local area is really, for most people, the only place where we can achieve change. The global climate change is so big that it does frighten people. It causes anxiety, it causes frustration. We very strongly feel that we cannot mitigate it globally. It's far too big for us, but we can do something locally. So that's where we can actually do things and make a difference. And so there's a high potential to be explored and capitalized on. So people do care for their local environment, and they will act to protect it when they see how they can do it, what they can do, when they can do it, when the relevance becomes clear. Next slide, please. So in the following few slides, I will talk a little bit about the idea for PATCCh, which is our new Wales-wide network, about the scope, goals, people and structure, and that will then be followed by a very short glimpse at some Bangor views and projects. Next slide, please. So first of all, PATCCh, the concept and structure for the Wales-wide network. Next slide. So PATCCh will have an interdisciplinary scope, or it already does. So there are a few different perspectives that I've just put on the slide here to give a bit of an impression. So if you look at it from a sociological point of view, we can look at local values, community actions, and so on. Then there might be a business perspective, looking at investment behavior, financial issues around climate change, marketing, and so on. A psychological perspective would probably be around behavior change, or maybe about the interplay of emotion and cognition in relevance to place and climate change. Then we could have a geographic perspectives, looking at places, people, and ecosystem services. Then there might be a technological perspective, looking at place-based engineering solutions. And then, of course, my perspective as a linguist is around place and climate, discourse and communication, about perceptions as expressed in discourse, about responsibilities, and so on. I will talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then, of course, very strongly involved the natural sciences perspectives. For instance, looking at flood risk, land use change, altered risk to places, ecosystems or heritage. And then again, one could use a creative arts perspective, looking at how local threats to heritage, for instance, affect people's sense of place. And I've put some possible research questions or questions that are actually already being looked at by people in the network into these bubbles, but I won't read them out here because you've probably had time to study them already. So next slide, please. So the goals of this new network are basically to combine two research strands that until quite recently they hadn't been very strongly connected, namely the notion of place and the notion of climate change. There has been a lot of work around the notion of place and what it means to people, particularly in geography, human geography. It's now also taken up by other disciplines. And it becomes particularly relevant in the area of climate change. And that's basically what the network is supporting. So the network will provide a platform for exchanging insights, ideas, methods, and so on. It will be useful, or it is already useful, for identifying collaborators for specific projects and grant proposals. And it fosters dissemination and knowledge exchange in this broad area of research. Next slide. So our vision is to facilitate transdisciplinary collaboration. So not just bringing people, experts from different disciplines together, but actually going beyond, going outside of academia, making connections with communities, stakeholders, governments, businesses, and so on, working towards major grant proposals, establishing and supporting critical mass, so getting the right people together for purposes that can be tackled with the sufficient number of people involved, to raise awareness for the topic, itself, because we believe that place-based approaches to climate change are really important. Also for the research excellence that is part of this network, because there are lots of people involved that bring in those different perspectives. And for the people, making it possible to be aware of each other, know each other, and that strengthens links across Wales and makes it a strong hub for related issues. Next slide. So currently we have 55 members on board, but we are open, and we are very happy to accept more people who are interested in place-based approaches to climate change with relation to Wales. So we have lots of universities and beyond from Wales itself, but also some people who are either very close to Wales, as in Chester, and one person, Lise Fontaine, who will give a talk in the next PATCCh seminar slot. She used to work in Wales and is therefore connected to Wales for that reason. So yeah, but we value every single member in our network and are very proud to have combined so many universities in this very lively network. Next slide. So some people, some aspects we do in terms of structure. We have this cross-institutional seminar series now established, which will happen once a month. We have a website put up, which is part of the WISERD website. So the PATCCh network is one of the many networks that are offered through the WISERD wider project. We have distributed responsibilities. There's a cross-institutional leadership team, there's a steering group, and there are thematic groups that meet to discuss themes. And we have meetings, so in various formats, so member meetings where everybody's invited to come. We have informal coffee chats, which are just an opportunity to get to know each other. We have these subgroup meetings, and we are planning in-person workshops. And there's more under development, but this is basically the structure and what we are doing. Next slide. Okay, so much for the PATCCh network as such. So we are now getting into the specifics of what we are doing at Bangor, and I'll kick off with some linguistic perspectives around the language of place and why it matters for climate change concerns. Next slide. So this wonderful picture shows the old and famous bridge, Menai Bridge. And we have done a study where we asked people to describe their local area and what it means to them personally. And this is one of the answers we got. And I think in terms of discourse around place, it shows very nicely just how we express place attachment in language and how much we can see from that. So this person said, I like the old bridge and looking down at the water beneath, the way the tide changes and reveals and hides different islands. The cormorants nesting on the bridge and the turbulence of the currents are fascinating to watch. I like how the straits have the feel of a river estuary all the way along, but with a different mouth depending where you are, despite not being an actual river. So you can basically see from that utterance just how much that person values the place. So looking more closely at the language, next slide, please, we can sort of take it apart a little bit and learn from how we talk about our surroundings. So there's some spatial language in there, so just describing the places or the locations, looking down from the old bridge, water under the bridge, cormorants on the bridge, or two sides of the river. So, but that's just the space, language of space, and it doesn't tell us much about what it means. There are also some expressions of experience where you can see how the person experiences these spaces. For instance, saying I like, or it's fascinating, or it has the feel of a river estuary. So that provides a bit more about the person's personal experience related to the places. And then there are some expressions where just the way location is expressed reveals the experience. So the water beneath, or the way the tide changes and reveals and hides different islands, that's almost poetic language. It's the way words are chosen that it as such expresses place attachment, even as space is described. Next slide, please. So looking at the experience of place from a language related perspective, we can see that we experience our surroundings individually personally, we relate to it, and we express that in language. We also experience our surroundings emotionally. So for instance, we find effective language in spatial descriptions. We find poetry on specific places that individuals have experienced and write poems about. And there's a lot to be found in language in various types of discourse around the experience of place. Next slide, please. So how can we address place and climate change in language? So we can look at the linguistic expression of the relation between places and climate change at different levels. So for instance, on the discourse level, it's around what kind of discourse or discourses are going on in society around climate change and the experience of place and threats to place, for instance. So people communicate their local perceptions, they communicate around activities, climate change related threats, and so on. And these various discourses can be looked at systematically to see what's important to people, how do they talk about it, what kinds of views do they express. And going down then to the lexical level, we can look at the key concepts that express values across languages. So in English, a lot of the discourse is actually around the word home. So this is my home, you know, my home patch and so on. In Welsh, we have some more expressions like hiraeth and cynefin, which I won't attempt to translate because there might not be a direct translation, but it's also expressing values for the home patch in various ways. There's a whole research area or methodology called ecolinguistics, where Aaron Stibbe is the most prominent author. Where it said that language encodes the stories that society is based on, and using ecolinguistics or an ecolinguistic discourse analytic approach, one could look at ideologies or framings, metaphors, evaluations, identities, convictions, erasure, salience. These are just the main concepts that are explored through the area of ecolinguistics. But I won't go into more detail with respect to that now. So next slide, please. I thought so. Yes, that was all my slides. So I'll hand over to Sofie now. Thank you.
Thanks, Thora. Diolch. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to offer quite a whistle-stop tour of two Bangor-based projects. So they were community engagement with environmental sustainability projects that ran over the last 12 months. So yeah. Sorry. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a project that looked at Gwyrddni. So Gwyrddni is a community-based climate action movement in Northwest Wales. And the aim of Gwyrddni is to bring people together to tackle climate change locally. So totally in keeping with what we've been talking about today. And in 2022 to 2023, Gwyrddni organised 5 climate assemblies to form community action plans. And what those community assemblies, so they were like citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, you know, these deliberative democracies that people might have heard of, where, you know, people come together, just local residents or members of the community come together to discuss a topic. And the topic of Gwyrddni's citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, was the climate and what people could do locally to tackle climate change. And the image on the screen is an image from one of the assemblies. So it's an image of the river, and people have plotted, or children have plotted, images of what matters to them, because the heading, which is in Welsh, says be sy'n bwysig I ni, so what's important to us or what matters to us. So this ties exactly in with what Thora said earlier about climate change mattering to us locally. So the whole concept of Gwyrddni really ties in with these place-based approaches and, you know, tackling climate change in the place that we live and where we care about. So we had a funded project that Thora was awarded by the LCEE, so the Low Carbon Energy and Environment Research Network Wales. LCEE is a lot easier. And our project was called Enhancing Community Involvement in Low Carbon Projects. a study of North West Wales climate assemblies with Gwyrddni as a case study. I'm not going to run through the 3 research areas, but I will focus on that last one just for today's talk because we haven't got a lot of time. So one of our research aims was to think about place attachment. So capitalizing on an area's specific features and people's place attachment, and that each place offers different ecosystem services and localized histories affecting people's place connections and community discourses. And what works for one community may not work elsewhere. And we wanted to examine these dynamics specifically for Wales. So the climate assemblies, there was in 5 locations in North West Wales, from Penllyn, which is northwest in the arm of Wales, as far east as the Bethesda area. So some of these locations were only about 10 miles away from each other. So geographically, all in Gwynedd, all in, Welsh-speaking heartlands. But we really wanted to see if there was a difference between, these places that were super close geographically, but, had their own distinct communities. So to just kind of capture what we found. So we found that those that did engage with Gwyrddni and they held community assemblies, 5 places with up to 50 people in each assembly. So I think on average about 30, so 30 times 5, quick maths, quite a few people. So we found that they were very engaged about climate matters, which makes sense because they've signed up to take part in the assemblies, but also that they were often equally or more concerned about other matters. And so what we found in this project, that there were other factors that motivated individuals or the communities to engage towards environmental sustainability. So we found the Welsh language as a pull, their cultural heritage, so hiraeth, like Thora mentioned earlier, is kind of like nostalgia, but it pulls at your heart a little bit more as a translation, I'd say. So their cultural heritage, and place attachment and their home patch. And it could seem quite unusual that, cultural heritage or Welsh language came up so much in a forum that debated climate matters. But what we sort of found is that, so we found these things, but it was corroborated by a study that was run by CAST. So CAST, the Centre for, I can't see that on my screen now, I can never know what these acronyms are. So the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. So they ran a pre-assembly questionnaire, and I think they got about 200 responses, with pretty much an even split between those who responded in the English language version and those that responded in the Welsh language version of the questionnaire. But what we found is that 93% of those who responded agreed that addressing climate emergency is important, as you'd expect. Same amount of people, 93%, said that the landscape and countryside of their area is important, which links back to the image that's on the footer of this slide, the image of the tree that Thora shared earlier. But what we found in the Welsh language survey was a little bit different. So when they were asked which of these issues are extremely important to you personally, so of course the English language and Welsh language respondents had this question, but when we look at what the Welsh language version respondents said, they said that climate change was extremely important. 66% said that. The destruction of wildlife, nature and biodiversity, again 66% said that. But when we talk about the Welsh language, 96% of this is extremely important. So despite them signing up to a climate assembly, despite them coming together to discuss the climate, when they're filling in their form before coming along, the Welsh language is still at the forefront of their minds. Where was I going with this now? So we have to think, so if you think about that first image I showed with what matters to us, beth yn bwysig I ni, it's not just climate, it's a mix of things, and taken together this motivated engagement. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But I know we haven't got a lot of time, so I'm going to talk quickly now about the second project. So this one was the Reclaim Network Plus project, which we ran last year. This was in partnership with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and Denbighshire County Council. And we were looking at local green space initiatives. So Denbighshire County Council were planting new trees, establishing wildflower meadows, and we wanted to see what the community perceptions of that was, you know, so this top-down intervention, because Gwyrddni was very grassroots, community-based level, you know, llawer gwlad, as we say, really grassroots, just the community coming together, whereas the Reclaim project was a top-down one, interventions organised by the local authority. And we had these three project aims. But for today, I'm just going to focus on residents' perspectives on green infrastructure interventions and how we compared them with perspectives across the UK. So what we did is we ran an online survey to gather people's thoughts on if their local council was delivering environmental changes such as tree planting and wildflower meadows. And this survey went out nationally to 1,860 people, and we shared it with 60 residents in Rhyl. So the national version went out through an online marketplace provider so that we could get, you know, the right mix of people, the right demographics, so that it was like an equal split. Whereas we promoted the Rhyl one through social media just to target people with the correct postcode. And what we found is that, people are ready for a change. Lots of literature points that people might be hesitant to adopt green infrastructure or new green interventions, but our surveys were super positive. So over 70% wanted more trees and wanted more wildflower meadows in their neighbourhoods. In some of the other questions, we found that there was place preference for trees and wildflower meadows. But what really stuck out is that people in Rhyl seemed to want more trees than the national average. And if I just skip back to the last slide, I don't know if you can really see it properly on your screens, but if you look at the top two graphs, which indicates the national respondents, and then the second two that indicates Rhyl, you can see that there is, you know, there's more in Rhyl that say they want more trees and more wildflower meadows than the national sample. This could point a little bit towards the way that we recruited people, because possibly the people in Rhyl, because of the way we were approaching it through social media, and you know, it wasn't going to them as cold, or it could be that they were more aware that their actual local council was doing something, whereas some of our national participants didn't have anything going on. But it was still a really positive response, and that people in Rhyl, really seemed to be quite happy to be having more trees and, you know, more green spaces. So what we did afterwards, after that online survey, is that we wanted to gather social data of Rhyl residents. So we conducted in-person interviews with people that had the correct Rhyl postcode to gather their thoughts about tree planting or establishing wildflower meadows. You can see a poster on the screen of what went out on social media to try and capture people to come along. And we interviewed 28 individuals, and this was a random stratified sample of Rhyl, which is quite important to emphasize, because a lot of the literature that I was reading before this pointed that, you know, similar surveys or interviews were done with people in parks. So the researcher would turn up and try and grab people as they're in the park to ask them about green space. Whereas ours, it went out on social media. I live over an hour away from Rhyl, so I couldn't really go there to chat to people off chance. I had to try and arrange it beforehand to then organise a time and a date to meet. So people, you know, put the time and effort in to come to the library to meet with me, to sit for an hour and to talk through the questions about GI projects in Rhyl. And what we found is that, the Rhyl residents, just like we found in our survey, they were overwhelmingly really supportive of schemes of this kind. 100% of them said that trees would improve the visual attractiveness of the area. 96% said that trees and wildflower meadows mattered to them. Biodiversity was important to 96% again. Health and well-being benefits were important to 100% of participants. So every single one of those that came to the interview agreed that the health and well-being benefits of trees or green spaces were important. And this is just a quote from one of our participants. who said that it's just a no-brainer, isn't it? Plant a tree and you get all those benefits. That's how I see it. And what was important about this project is that often the council have heard from really unhappy voices about changes, environmental changes in their neighbourhood. People might contact the council to complain. But in the interviews, they were really, they were a very friendly bunch. They were really happy to talk about it, but they were really positive as well. They wanted to see more. They were really behind what the council were doing. And those negative voices were, definitely a minority. So it was very positive. So my final slide, just to bring these two projects together. So if we think about a research question, such as what are the key factors that motivate individuals and communities in different areas across Wales or across the UK to engage towards environmental sustainability? Well, we found that in North West Wales, the key factors are place attachment, linguistic and cultural Welsh identity, and hiraeth. And in Rhyl, in North Wales, we found place attachment and health and wellbeing benefits. And that's it from me.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sophie. And just it occurred to me possibly that we haven't mentioned the reason that we picked these three projects, because you'll be looking at this and thinking, how's it connected to what I've just heard? Obviously, Thora and Sophie and myself have known each other through working together in different projects in Bangor, where we started a very similar network within Bangor University called PATCCh Places of Climate Change. And so we thought for this inaugural kind of patch seminar, it was nice to give a couple of just clues as to the types of things, the range of things that we could get up to within the bigger patch network, and just draw on the experiences that we've had in the Bangor project. So you've heard a little bit about linguistics, you've now heard a little bit about social and kind of local place, and now completely different perhaps is to think about material perspectives, and you'll be wondering what on earth that's to do with. So next slide, Sophie. I can't see it yet. Okay, so I was thinking, what's the connection, climate and net zero? And to me, it's obvious, but not necessarily to everybody. So just to start from the point that everything we do, everything that we choose to eat, whether it's kind of from meat, whether it's posh food, whatever else, everything that we buy, choose, wear, everything has a carbon footprint. So it's not just, and it often is put across as energy use in your home, but it's every single thing that we do every day has a carbon footprint. Obviously, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is very strongly connected to climate change. This is why we're in the fix that we are. So as a materials scientist, I'm interested in the materials and the choices people are making, but also I think anybody who's driven by climate considerations needs to be starting to think about their material choices or the choices their companies make, or etc., the travel, the food, etc. To me, a key element is the built environment, and in that sense you get that we're living in these spaces. It's the spaces and places that we experience, so it brings a place element, but also it's constructed from materials, and an enormous amount of carbon is attached to certain ways that we build things. But also you've got the natural environment on our doorstep where some of these resources come from. So you'll see all sorts of connections through the course of this talk. Now, net zero is this aspiration by people such as governments, driven by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and their repeated warnings to governments that we need to be starting to reduce our emissions nationally, but as society as a whole. And commonly what people talk about is getting to zero emissions by about 2050. That's the legally binding target in the UK. There are lots of debates to and fro governing whether other people sign up to that and so on. But it would be nice to get there. It's actually getting much closer these days than it seemed when we first started on the journey. Next slide. So within PATCCh Places of Climate Change, the network I mentioned, we secured a very small amount of money to hold an interdisciplinary workshop. And this was led by Thora, but Sofie and myself were both involved in different ways. And the aim was to bring people together to discuss this. We kind of put the climate change and net zero front and center alongside the concept of place. So we brought in keynote speakers, people representing Welsh Government. We had a local council. We had Grant Paisley is one of the faces in the picture there. He's connected to the Gwyrddni project you heard about with what Sofie's talked about. And we had a chap from Morlais or Menter Môn, two entities that are connected to projects with energy, renewable energy on Anglesey. So we brought these very different perspectives, all of them talking very knowledgeably, very close to the subject, and with loads and loads of practical experience. And we welcomed our participants to hear all of these things and to consider how it, you know, these are good examples. This is the aspiration from the people who are engaged. And we wanted to create a space where we could all, as academics and society, discuss what was going on. So I think there's another little bit if we click again. So we invited the participants to come prepared to think, to listen, to challenge and collaborate. So we spent the morning listening to these talks, and then in the afternoon we had facilitated discussions. We had a series of breakout rooms. We looked at things very interdisciplinarily, and we, through that course of the breakout rooms, we developed some really interesting clusters of interest. We had a couple of ideas that worked towards funding bids, and we also had some that resulted in other activities in Bangor sort of later on. Nobody ever plotted the origins back to this, but it made me think of some of the discussions that had happened. So I think there was a real knock-on benefit amongst the academic community. But we also had some surprising voices in the room, people who just potentially were used to trying to pick holes. Anybody else who's doing climate things might be suspicious. I'd like to do it this way, and anybody who doesn't see my solution as the right one. So there are some interesting perspectives, I think, when you think about engaging with people and their very, very different backgrounds and reasons for thinking they're doing the right thing. We know that there are so many solutions. We can't all be doing everything the same way. So it's really good to get everybody together, but it can be interesting when you're trying to work up projects. I think that's what I'm trying to communicate by that one. So next slide, let's see here, just to show a couple of the outputs. I mean, this was the very active process. We had lots of kind of sessions on Padlet, and we had, you know, boards where you're putting all your post-it notes, and lots of concepts were captured from all the voices in the room, and we were able to go on thinking about those afterwards. Let's go to the next one. I think, and this is stepping slightly back from the workshop, because I'm a materials scientist, I tend to be thinking about carbon footprint quite a lot. Because I work with bio-based materials, I probably think about carbon footprint slightly more than the average scientist. So to me, it was quite refreshing to realize how many different people needed different gaps in their knowledge. But I think for all of us here today, it's interesting to think about, there has been definitely in the last sort of 10 years a shift as companies are wanting to reduce their carbon footprint because they know that it matters. They know they've got to report their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but also they know that their customers, by and large, want to see this change. You know, people are calling for better products, and they want something greener. They want to feel that, you know, compact detergent is kind of better for the planet than a larger quantity with more packaging, or all these different things. And then we've also got companies who are looking to do more bio-based or more green chemistry, or to look at not just reducing their carbon footprint, but also increasing the storage of carbon that's been sequestered by plants, or by, in particular, by trees, so that we're taking the carbon out of the atmosphere, as well as reducing the amount that goes back in. So those two things kind of crop up in all sorts of aspects of my work. I think there's another little bit here. Now, if we step away over the fence into sort of forestry and agriculture, you can think about where those trees, perhaps if we're talking about the timber, or maybe the type of fields, if you're talking about other bio-based materials, where those materials have come from and the type of landscape, what does it look like? And the land managers might be seeking to grow their crops the best way that they can, but they might also be thinking, well, I need to do it in a way that minimizes the amount of flooding, that way that's sensitive to wildlife, and a way that's okay for the people who want to come walking through here because there's a beauty spot and they want to generally do the right thing, in my experience. So I think that, you know, I'm in this lovely position, I suppose, where at the one end we've got the factory trying to make good changes, and at the other end we've got the landscape based on the farm or the forest. And in both places, people can be making choices that are working towards improving the situation of the climate. Next slide. So this is a little doodle just to round things up, to kind of try and show how things happen at the one end and at the other. And the more I put into here, the more I realized how many other things happen. So you got the person in the factory trying to use things as well as possible to make the product. So there's lots of focus there. Other colleagues of mine work at that kind of level. But then you've got the product goes out to the shop and the customer chooses between product A, B, and C, and they like this one. It's got a little statement or maybe a logo saying it's recycled, or all these eco brandings. But you've also got the media saying, buy this, do this, it's better. Or possibly saying, oh, forget about the planet, buy that, it's the luxurious. So there's a lot of work for social scientists, I was thinking. You know, we can make enormous strides in terms of managing our land better, in improving our products, but we can also think about the responsibility that society itself has for the way that we sell things to each other, the way we encourage different behaviors in each other, the way we reaffirm, oh, that's a good idea, don't go on holiday there, go here, it's less flight, or all these other things. And then obviously to close the loop, anything that we've consumed potentially ends up as waste and potentially, hopefully, is recycled these days. And that adds to more materials challenges. So I think one extra click, Sofie. Another aspect here is the policy and government, and they can obviously affect everything. They can really drive things for the companies doing stuff, but they're increasingly interested, I think, in what's happening in the consumer end, and just influencing the way society is working together. And I think maybe this is a timely comment, given the recent rounds of funding that we've seen. There's a lot of very interdisciplinary UKRI funding trying to look at net zero, or trying to look at climate change, or trying to look at transformation, because we realise the importance of the people side in the materials, but also the materials on the landscape, and so on and so forth. So hopefully there's plenty of food for thought. This may be the last slide, is it? To sum up, we've got, I think there's lots of scope for interdisciplinary work. I don't need to really over-egg that more than I've just said. Understanding our motivations for everything that we do comes from understanding how people tick, and goes right back to Thora and her linguistics, or to Sofie with her community assemblies. Another click, perhaps. We need to have lots of discernment about which data is factual, which data is guidance, and which bits are subject to all these nuances in bias, and how we understand each other's motivations, as well as how we can be dispassionate about our own. You know, are we actually as good as we think? And finally, strongest point of all is that solutions to the climate crisis can happen in surprising places, but really need to be happening in those surprising places too. So thank you for listening. There we go.
Many thanks to the three of you. I was looking for the reactions button. Right, so we've got a very small audience. I've got lots of questions, but I will open the floor to others first, because that's good practice. So any questions? Amy?
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed all of your 3 talks. I don't really know, I don't have a specific question, but I just found especially the first 2 talks around language and what people care about really interesting. We did a project earlier this year where we asked people, like, what does a good life mean to them? With the premise around, will people talk about the environment if you don't ask them explicitly, do you care about the environment? And it's quite interesting to see what people would say and how these were more or less sustainable, because I think this wasn't necessarily just a Welsh sample, it was very international. But people would say things like, oh, my family, a few people would say nature, but very few people would say, oh, sustainability or climate change being kind of hindered or any of these kind of things. So I think as well as the language that people use being important, also thinking about what kind of questions do we ask people to actually find out this information, and kind of our role of thinking about the language we have as researchers, as well as what our participants give back to us. But yes, I was really interested by your talks, and maybe you both can help me with all of this data that I've got to analyse.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that sounds really interesting. Just the kind of language or discourse data that I love looking at, just to see, you know, what are the kinds of things that come up spontaneously, and in what way are they framed, formulated, and, you know, what kinds of things are perhaps presupposed, and so on. And it is possible, as you say, that the way the question was framed or formulated didn't exactly push people towards thinking of threats to a good life as such. So it might have been enough to just say nature is great, and of course if nature is threatened, then that takes away from the good life, but that wasn't part of the question. So but it's very interesting, as you say, and yeah, would like to talk more about that as well. Thanks.
Anyone else? Milia?
Hi, just to say thank you, super interesting, and it's really good to get going with having these exchanges in terms of ideas. And I'm very new to the place-based thinking. I come from international politics background, where we deal, of course, with places, but different kinds of places in different parts of the world, and so on. And in relation to that, I suppose, I mean, one thing that's of interest to me, and some projects that we've been working on, is on dealing with refugee communities and migrant communities, and their kind of ways of processing their own kind of identity shifts through their environmental kind of conditions in a new country, in a new place, in a sense. And I wondered if anyone had done work on kind of refugee communities and their processing of identity, language, the environment as a kind of a set of kind of reference points as you're processing, you know, big shifts. Just wondered if you know of such research in the Welsh context in particular. We've done some work in other parts of the UK, but wondered if that had been done in Wales.
I haven't, but I find it really interesting. The only concern that I have when thinking about that, how do you collect data? Because the refugees probably have a lot of things to deal with in their lives, and they don't necessarily want to be bothered by surveys or something like that. But I might be wrong there. Maybe they're quite happy to engage that way. It's something I haven't looked at, not because I'm not interested, but just, you know, can't do everything. But yeah, if there's something going on to share, then I'd be quite interested in having a chat about that. I think it is a very, very important group of people to look at, because I think it's a fact of climate change that people can't carry on with their life as they have done in many places of the earth. So already we have a lot of movement, migration going on, not just because of wars as before, but because livelihood is no longer possible where the people come from. And I'm not sure to what extent people are aware of that this is happening all around the world already, because we can still carry on living in Wales. There's no problem with that so far, and we don't expect any massive problems for the next few years either. But elsewhere, it's already the case that places become unlivable. And so this is a growing group and a growing concern, and we do have to understand what exactly is going on there. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's difficult work, of course. I mean, lots of detailed ethics processing and ethics approvals, but there are experts that are working on this. I'm working with some of them in some other contexts. But listening to you also just got me thinking about whether, yeah, working with some of the local refugee communities, actually, say in Aberystwyth, might be a possibility for exploring some of these things, because there's a tendency also often to think about the place in relation to climate as something that involves, I don't know, environmental groups or farmers, or groups that are specifically dealing with, I don't know, food surplus kind of organizations or whatever. But of course, yeah, like widening the range of communities to deal with, in a sense, yeah, it's something to think on. I don't have a question other than that, but just, yeah, you really got me thinking on yeah, some thoughts. Thanks.
Just very quickly to respond to Amelia, I know about a project called Optic, run by Marin Thomas from Swansea, and she hasn't set out to work with refugees or asylum seekers specifically, but because she went out to work with communities, she did engage with refugees and asylum seekers in that framework, and so there are some results in the pipeline for that. But I think that's maybe, instead of looking to engage with these specific communities, just go for the local, and you'll find a sample of everything in kind of every one of us in the local. And so in a sense, that brings me to my question. I've got 3 or 4 questions, but I realize it's all to do with the same bigger question. So how do we engage with people who do not think like us? Because I was thinking, there's this kind of self-selection bias, and I noticed that one of in the second point in one of Sofie's slides, it says conducting assembly meetings such that all voices get heard while avoiding heated arguments. And it's interesting that went into the aims, because it's so difficult, and we tend to really end up talking to the ones who tend to think a bit like us, and dialogue with those who think really differently is really difficult sometimes. And I think there's a lot of value in understanding people's motivations. Morwenna was saying, understanding what is it that gets people thinking that way, and how can we understand one another better.
If I can go in I can answer a bit, and maybe Morwenna can bring her perspective in as well. What we found in the 2 projects that I skimmed over, so in the Gwyrddni one, that the Welsh language was something that was a huge hook for people. And in the talks, because I sat in a couple of the assemblies just to really get a flavour of what was going on, to hear the discussion, to obviously take frantic notes. But there was a discussion about the Welsh language that took about an hour within that session, and it wasn't even a question on the topic. So it was just something that people were so passionate about. And it did feel that maybe some members were there to talk about the things that mattered to them, which was language and their culture and their home, and environmental matters just sort of weaved into that. So you've got the 2 groups of people. So you've got some people that didn't engage at all. They're not interested. Goodbye. The flyer just gets thrown into the recycling. They don't click the link. They don't want to know. You've also got some people that obviously did join the assemblies, didn't like that format and also didn't want to engage. And we had people in the PATCCh seminar that Morwenna talked about that, you know, had louder voices about other things. But what we did find in both the Rhyl and the Gwyrddni project, which I kind of summarised a little bit at the end, is these other hooks that people engaged with. So one of the Rhyl participants, not particularly keen on trees, but really, really valued health and wellbeing benefits. So then you can frame communication about the things that do matter to people, and it just goes straight back to the beginning of today's talk with what Thora was talking about, you know, what matters to us locally, and oftentimes the place we care about trumps any dismissal of climate change, I guess. If your river is, you know, not being too healthy because of climate change, or, you know, the trees around you are dying, you might do something about it, whether you believe the scientists and the science or not, you know, and that's the hook. So it's the things that people care about. We found cultural heritage, place attachment, Welsh language and health and well-being as some of the top things that connected to climate action, or, you know, more positivity towards climate mitigation, that didn't have to be directly about the climate in that sense. And that might be a way of framing communications, or, you know, reframing the discourse about it, about what matters to people as a whole, the good life point that Amy brought in. So you don't have to talk about it as climate change, but it kind of is climate change. So that's something interesting, but we still don't know what, you know, what would stop the barriers for certain groups of engagement. There's just, you know, how do you motivate the hard to reach people? I still don't know, but I think that might be a step towards it.
Yeah, it was a very good point, Geraldine, because I was thinking something similar, I think, during the talks, that it is so easy for people to opt out. You know, if they're a climate denier, they probably won't come to a citizens' assembly about it unless they really want to come in with their soapbox and kind of make a visible protest. But equally, I suppose there are those times where it's challenging because there are trade-offs. You know, the more that we talk about climate change, I think, in this decade that's coming, rather than in the previous one where it's been fairly easy to pick one or two big causes to champion. And I mentioned energy as we were going. But I think as we go forwards, there will be so many trade-offs that people need to make. And it's the same with all the other aspects of sustainability, that there are trade-offs. But in the case of climate change, you know, you'll have people who say, well, I need to go on doing my business and making my product because, and somebody else will say, but your product's rubbish, you know, and other people saying, well, this is essential, so the trade-off is somewhere else instead. And one person's solution will be to not go on holiday, and another person's solution will be to put on an extra jumper and leave the heat. You know, there'll be those trade-offs will become more and more difficult to talk about. And I think there's an element there that communication, given what we see in current society, where we are maybe finding it harder to talk about trade-offs per se in other contexts, it will become more challenging to talk about climate change trade-offs as well. So I think that's a really big topic. I've got no solutions for it, but I know that often if I'm on a outreach stand, you know, at some sort of event or other, it's always useful, like Sofie mentioned, to have, well, I can engage this person on this or that, and they're all benefits from the same thing. But you can only do that for so long before it feels like you're shying away from making the progress in a specific area because I've hit a brick. But possibly that's the best way to handle it. I don't actually know, don't have any answers. It would be great as the network develops if we can look into some of these things. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I've just noticed the time. Not a very good timekeeper. Any other questions that we would like to ask before we bring the session to a close? I think that's fine. We're lucky with a small audience. We'll need to be more careful in the future. But thank you so much to the three of you. It's been a great starting point for discussions, really comprehensive view of what you've done at Bangor, and thank you so much. I can't keep up with the chat and talk at the same time. But thank you very much to everyone, and we'll meet again for Lisa's serious seminar next month. I don't remember exactly the time, but I will send the calendar invite and email 2 weeks before. But thank you very much. I'll stop recording now.